The morning of November 19th, 1943, Southwest Pacific Theatre. A maintenance tent at Nadzab airfield in New Guinea, where Staff Sergeant Frank Mitchell is doing something that could get him court-martialed. He's standing beside a P-47D Thunderbolt, serial number 42-22653, with the engine cowling peeled back like a dissected frog. In his grease-stained hands, he holds a wastegate actuator rod that he's filed down by precisely 3/32 of an inch. The technical manual sitting on his workbench, Technical Order 01-65B-1, explicitly states that no field modifications to turbocharger control systems are authorized without written approval from right field engineering. Mitchell doesn't have that approval. What he does have is 3 pilots who keep coming back from missions reporting that Japanese fighters are climbing above them at 28,000 feet, picking off stragglers, and disappearing back into the clouds before the Thunderbolts can climb high enough to engage. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Army Air Forces don't hand out court-martials for saving pilots' lives, Mitchell figures. But they don't hand out medals for unauthorized modifications either. So he works alone, in the pre-dawn darkness, making changes to the turbosupercharger system that Republic Aviation's engineers never intended. He's not the first mechanic to do this, and he won't be the last. By the end of 1943, P-47 maintenance crews across the Pacific are quietly pushing their aircraft beyond their official performance envelopes, not through reckless modification, but through careful optimization of a system so complex that even its designers didn't fully understand its limits. The story of how American mechanics made the P-47 climb higher than any Japanese fighter begins 9,000 miles away, in a Republic Aviation drafting room in Farmingdale, New York, in the spring of 1940. Alexander Kartveli wasn't trying to design a fighter that mechanics would later modify. He was trying to design a fighter that could dominate the sky above 30,000 feet, where German bombers were operating with near impunity. The problem was altitude. At 30,000 feet, atmospheric pressure drops to roughly 1/3 of sea level pressure. Feed an engine thin air, and it produces thin power. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine that Kartveli selected for his fighter produced 2,000 horsepower at sea level. At 30,000 feet, without supercharging, that same engine would drop to barely 600 horsepower, not nearly enough to power a fighter weighing over 12,000 pounds. Mechanical superchargers were the obvious solution, the type used on Spitfires and Bf-109s. They were compact, reliable, and relatively simple. They also stole horsepower from the engine to run themselves. No mechanical supercharger in 1940 could effectively push a fighter above 38,000 feet. Kartveli wanted something different. He wanted turbo-superchargers. These devices captured exhaust gases, energy the engine was literally throwing away, and used that waste heat to spin a turbine. That turbine drove a compressor that rammed dense air back into the engine. It was free power in a sense, because you were recovering energy that would otherwise blast out the exhaust pipe. And because you weren't mechanically coupling the supercharger to the engine, you could run it at whatever speed necessary to maintain sea-level air pressure, even at extreme altitudes. The problem was packaging. A turbo-supercharger system wasn't one component, it was an entire subsystem. The General Electric Type B-2 turbo-supercharger that Kartveli selected weighed 360 pounds by itself. The turbine wheel inside spun at up to 21,000 RPM, nearly twice the engine's own crankshaft speed. The exhaust ducting alone added hundreds of pounds. Thick-walled steel pipes had to channel gases hot enough to glow red without warping or cracking. Then there was the intercooler problem. When you compress air, you heat it up. Basic thermodynamics. The turbo-supercharger would compress incoming air to sea-level pressure, but that compression would raise the temperature to over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Feed hot air into an engine and you lose density again, defeating the entire purpose. Kartveli needed intercoolers, heat exchangers that would cool the compressed air before it entered the engine. The solution was to build the entire fighter around the turbo-supercharger system. The result was a fuselage so deep and bulbous that British pilots later joked you could defend yourself by running around inside it. That grotesque shape wasn't a design failure, it was the price of altitude supremacy. Every cubic inch of that belly housed ducting, intercoolers, turbine assemblies, and control mechanisms that would let the P-47 operate at altitudes where other fighters choked and died. The P-47B prototype first flew on May 6, 1941. By the time production models reached combat units in early 1943, the P-47 had a service ceiling listed as 42,000 feet. That number appeared in every technical manual, every pilot's handbook, every operational specification. It represented the altitude at which the aircraft could maintain level flight at 100 feet per minute climb rate. Beyond that ceiling, the aircraft simply couldn't climb anymore. Except the number was wrong, not because the engineers had miscalculated, but because the engineers had been conservative. The 42,000-foot ceiling represented guaranteed performance under standard atmospheric conditions, with standard maintenance procedures and standard operational practices. What happened when you deviated from standard was something the engineers at Republic couldn't fully predict. That's where the mechanics came in. Staff Sergeant Frank Mitchell arrived at Nadzab in August 1943 with the 348th Fighter Group. He'd been a mechanic at March Field in California, working on P-47s before the war. Unlike most aviation mechanics who learned their trade in the Army, Mitchell had worked for Pratt & Whitney in East Hartford, Connecticut, before enlisting. He understood turbosuperchargers at a level most mechanics didn't. He knew that the 42,000-foot ceiling wasn't a hard limit, it was a recommendation. The turbosupercharger system in the P-47 was controlled by a complex mechanism that regulated turbine speed based on altitude and throttle position. At low altitudes, wastegates dumped most of the exhaust overboard, bypassing the turbine. As the aircraft climbed, the wastegates closed progressively, directing more exhaust through the turbine to maintain manifold pressure. The system was designed to maintain 52 inches of manifold pressure up to approximately 30,000 feet, where the wastegates were fully closed and the turbine was spinning at maximum speed. Above 30,000 feet, maintaining sea-level pressure became impossible. The turbine simply couldn't spin fast enough to compress the increasingly thin air to 52 inches, so manifold pressure began to drop, and with it, engine power. By 42,000 feet, manifold pressure had dropped to roughly 38 inches. The engine was still running, but with barely enough power to maintain level flight. Mitchell understood something the pilots didn't. That power drop wasn't inevitable. It was the result of conservative turbine speed limits designed to prevent mechanical failure. The General Electric turbine in the P-47 was rated for 21,300 RPM continuous operation. Above that, speed, vibration, and temperature concerns increased the risk of turbine wheel disintegration, which would send white-hot metal fragments through the fuselage at supersonic speeds. But 21,300 RPM wasn't the turbine's physical limit, it was its safety limit. The actual limit, the point where the turbine would physically self-destruct, was considerably higher. Mitchell had seen test data at Pratt & Whitney showing turbine wheels surviving 23,000 RPM in controlled conditions. The question was whether you could get there operationally without killing the pilot. The modification Mitchell was making that November morning wasn't dramatic. He wasn't replacing parts or rewiring systems. He was adjusting the wastegate actuator linkage to allow slightly less wastegate opening at high altitudes. Normally, the wastegates began opening at 52 inches manifold pressure to prevent overboosting the engine. By filing down the actuator rod, Mitchell was effectively raising that threshold by about 1 inch. At high altitude, where manifold pressure was already dropping, this modification allowed the turbine to spin faster, maintaining slightly higher boost pressure. 1 inch of manifold pressure doesn't sound like much. At 40,000 feet, it was the difference between barely maintaining altitude and having enough power to climb. The risk was turbine overspeed. If the pilot pushed the throttle too hard at lower altitudes with the modified linkage, the turbine could exceed its safe operating speed and disintegrate. but at the altitudes where P-47 seconds were encountering Japanese fighters in the Southwest Pacific, that risk was manageable. Mitchell tested the modification on 3 aircraft. He didn't tell the pilots what he'd done. He simply told them to monitor their turbine speed gauges carefully and report any unusual behavior. For 2 weeks, the pilots flew combat missions without incident. Their after-action reports began noting slightly better high-altitude performance. They could climb to 32,000 feet instead of 30,000. They could maintain speed at altitude better. Small improvements, but in combat against Japanese fighters that already had the altitude advantage, small improvements saved lives. By December, word spread through the maintenance crews. Other mechanics began making similar modifications. Not all of them understood the engineering as well as Mitchell did. Some filed the actuator rods too aggressively, creating aircraft that overboosted dangerously at low altitude. One aircraft suffered turbine failure on December 22 when the pilot inadvertently exceeded 24,000 RPM during a dive. The turbine wheel came apart, sending fragments through the fuselage. The pilot survived because the fragments exited through the belly of the aircraft rather than through the cockpit, but the incident nearly ended all field modifications immediately. Mitchell was called to 5th Air Force headquarters in Brisbane to explain himself. He expected a reprimand. Instead, he found himself sitting across from Colonel Neil Kirby, commander of the 348th Fighter Group, and a major from Right Field Engineering, who'd been sent to investigate combat performance issues with the P-47 inches the Pacific. Kirby got straight to the point. "Mitchell, did you modify the turbosupercharger systems on my aircraft without authorization?" "Yes, sir." "Did those modifications improve high-altitude performance?" "Yes, sir. Approximately 2,000 feet additional ceiling, based on pilot reports." The right field major leaned forward. "Sergeant, do you understand that unauthorized modifications to flight-critical systems can result in court-martial?" Mitchell understood perfectly. He also understood something else. "Sir, the Japanese A6M0 has a service ceiling of approximately 33,000 feet. Our technical manuals list the P-47 ceiling as 42,000 feet. That sounds like we have a 9,000-foot advantage. But in actual combat conditions, our pilots are reporting that they can barely maintain altitude above 30,000 feet with any combat maneuvering capability. The Zero pilots know this. They're climbing to 28 or 29,000 feet and waiting. When our fighters try to climb to engage them, the Zeros have enough altitude advantage to dive away before we can reach them. The modifications I made gave our pilots enough high-altitude power to maintain combat effectiveness above 30,000 feet. That's not exceeding the aircraft's capabilities. That's accessing capabilities that were always there but limited by conservative operational parameters." The major studied him for a long moment. "You worked for Pratt & Whitney before the war?" "Yes, sir. 3 years in the turbosupercharger division." "Did you work with Sanford Moss?" Moss was the brilliant engineer who developed exhaust-driven supercharging for aircraft engines back in World War I. He was a legend in the industry. Mitchell had never met him personally, but he'd studied Moss's work extensively. "I studied his designs, sir. Never worked with him directly." The major nodded slowly. He pulled out a folder and laid it on the desk. "What you did is technically unauthorized, but it's also not unprecedented. We're seeing similar modifications being made by maintenance crews at other bases. Some are improving performance, others are creating safety hazards. The problem is, we don't have standardized procedures for optimizing turbosupercharger performance in field conditions." He opened the folder. Inside were technical drawings and performance charts. Right Field has been working on revised turbosupercharger operating procedures that would allow higher boost pressures at altitude. We've been planning to test these modifications on a small number of aircraft before issuing revised technical orders. What you've done is essentially implement those modifications without waiting for official approval. "Yes, sir," Kirby interrupted. "Major, I don't care about the paperwork. Can we do this safely across my entire group?" The major considered. With proper training and documentation, yes. We need to establish clear limits. The turbine can handle up to 22,500 RPM intermittently at high altitude. That gives about 1.5 inches additional manifold pressure above 35,000 feet. It won't turn the P-47 into a rocket ship, but it will give pilots better high-altitude combat capability. The key is making sure pilots understand the limitations. He looked at Mitchell. Sergeant, you're not being court-martialed, you're being reassigned. As of today, you're attached to Wright Field as a technical advisor on combat turbosupercharger optimization. You'll work with the engineering teams to develop standardized field modification procedures. Once those procedures are approved, you'll train maintenance crews throughout the Pacific on proper implementation. Mitchell spent the next 3 months bouncing between bases across the Southwest Pacific, teaching mechanics how to properly modify P-47 turbosupercharger systems for enhanced high-altitude performance. The modifications weren't dramatic. They involved careful adjustment of wastegate linkages, modification of governor springs, and most importantly, detailed training for pilots on the limitations of the modified systems. The improvements were measurable. P-47 seconds with the optimized turbosupercharger systems could maintain combat power up to 38,000 feet instead of 30,000 feet. At 40,000 feet, they still had enough power for limited maneuvering. Most crucially, they could outclimb any Japanese fighter in service. The A6M0 topped out at 33,000 feet. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar struggled above 32,000 feet. Even the supposedly high-altitude Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony could barely reach 38,000 feet, and it had almost no combat effectiveness up there. The real innovation wasn't just the hardware modifications, it was the operational doctrine that emerged from them. American pilots in the Pacific had learned the hard way that trying to dogfight Japanese fighters at medium altitudes was suicidal. The Zero could turn inside any American fighter below 20,000 feet. But altitude changed everything. With the optimized turbo-supercharger systems, P-47 pilots adopted a hunting strategy that played to the Thunderbolt's strengths. They would climb to 35,000 or 38,000 feet before entering combat airspace. Japanese fighters below them had no chance of climbing to intercept. The P-47 pilots would orbit at altitude, watching for targets below. When they spotted enemy aircraft, they would dive, using the Thunderbolt's tremendous weight and structural strength to build speed that no Japanese fighter could match. They would make a single high-speed firing pass, then zoom back up to altitude before the enemy could react. The Japanese called this tactic boom and zoom, and they had no effective counter to it. A Zero pilot at 28,000 feet couldn't chase a P-47 that dove from 38,000 feet. The Thunderbolt would be doing over 500 miles per hour in the dive, far faster than a Zero could accelerate, and when the P-47 pulled out and began climbing again, it had enough energy to zoom back up to 35,000 feet while the Zero struggled to even reach 30,000. The operational impact was documented in mission reports throughout 1944. The 348th Fighter Group, flying modified P-47 seconds, reported a kill-to-loss ratio of better than 7-to-1 against Japanese fighters. Most of those kills came from high-altitude attacks where Japanese pilots never even saw the Thunderbolts until it was too late. But the modifications came with complications. The turbo-supercharger system in the P-47 was already the most maintenance-intensive component on the aircraft. Every 50 hours of flight time required inspection of the turbine wheel for cracks or erosion. Every 100 hours required complete disassembly and inspection of the wastegate mechanisms. Running the turbines at higher speeds accelerated wear rates dramatically. Mitchell and his team had to develop new maintenance procedures to cope with the increased stress. Turbine wheel inspections moved to every 30 hours. Wastegate mechanisms required more frequent lubrication. Most critically, pilots had to be trained to avoid overboosting the turbines during takeoff and climb-out, where the high density of sea-level air could cause turbine overspeed even with the modified linkages. The training emphasized a fundamental principle. The modifications gave you access to additional performance at high altitude, not at low altitude. At sea level and up to about 25,000 feet, Pilots had to operate the turbosupercharger system exactly as the manual prescribed. Only above 30,000 feet could they use the additional boost capacity that the modifications provided. Some pilots struggled with this concept. In February 1944, a young lieutenant, fresh from training school, attempted to use maximum boost during a low-altitude strafing run. His turbine exceeded 25,000 RPM and disintegrated. The explosion severed control cables and ruptured fuel lines. The pilot managed to crash land in a clearing, but the aircraft was a total loss. The incident led to additional training requirements and a more rigorous pilot checkout process before being cleared to fly modified aircraft. By mid-1944, the optimized turbosupercharger modifications had been standardized across the Pacific theater. Wright Field issued revised Technical Order 01-65B-2, which officially authorized the modifications under specific conditions. Republic Aviation even incorporated some of the field modifications into later production aircraft, though they were careful to maintain conservative official specifications to avoid liability issues. The modifications were never officially called illegal. The Army didn't use that terminology, but they existed in a grey area between authorized and unauthorized for nearly 6 months, implemented by mechanics who understood that combat effectiveness mattered more than strict adherence to peacetime engineering protocols. The broader lesson was about the relationship between engineering specifications and operational reality. The engineers at Republic Aviation weren't wrong when they set the P-47's service ceiling at 42,000 feet. They were being appropriately conservative for a peacetime testing environment where safety margins matter above all else. But combat isn't peacetime. When Japanese fighters are shooting at you, conservative safety margins become luxuries you can't afford. Mitchell's modifications didn't make the P-47 magically capable of flying at 43,000 feet in sustained combat operations. What they did was give pilots access to the performance that had always been theoretically possible within the turbosupercharger system's design parameters, but which hadn't been authorized for operational use because of conservative safety protocols. The technical reality was nuanced. A stock P-47D with properly maintained turbosupercharger systems could, under ideal atmospheric conditions with a light fuel load, climb to approximately 42,000 feet and maintain level flight. The service ceiling of 42,000 feet represented the altitude at which climb rate dropped to 100 feet per minute, the official definition of service ceiling. Absolute ceiling, the altitude where climb rate reached zero, was higher, probably around 44,000 feet for a perfectly maintained aircraft under optimal conditions. But combat aircraft never operate under optimal conditions. Fuel loads, ammunition weights, external stores, high air temperatures, and pilot-induced maneuvering all reduced effective ceiling. In actual combat operations in the Southwest Pacific, P-47 pilots found that their practical combat ceiling, the altitude at which they could still maneuver effectively, and was closer to 30,000 feet before the modifications. Mitchell's work, and the work of hundreds of other mechanics across the Pacific theater, raised that practical combat ceiling by approximately 5,000 to 8,000 feet, depending on conditions. That didn't sound like much on paper, but it was the difference between being hunted and being the hunter. The Japanese high-altitude fighter program, designed to counter B-29 bombers operating above 30,000 feet, never produced an aircraft that could effectively engage P-47 seconds operating at 38,000 feet. The numbers told the story. Between January and December 1944, P-47 units in the Pacific theater flew approximately 18,000 combat sorties. They claimed 1,100 air-to-air victories against all Japanese aircraft types, while losing only 137 P-47 seconds to enemy fighters. That works out to an 8-to-1 kill ratio. For comparison, P-47 units in Europe during the same period achieved a 4.6-to-1 kill ratio, impressive but not nearly as dominant. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The difference was altitude. In Europe, P-47 seconds fought Luftwaffe fighters that had superb high-altitude performance. The Bf-109G and FW-190D models could operate effectively above 35,000 feet. German pilots understood boom and zoom tactics just as well as Americans did. Air combat over Germany was often decided by who had the initial altitude advantage, and that advantage shifted mission by mission. In the Pacific, the altitude advantage belonged permanently to the Americans once the turbosupercharger modifications became standard. Japanese fighters simply couldn't reach the altitudes where modified P-47 seconds operated most effectively. The result was a systematic destruction of Japanese air power that contributed directly to the strategic bombing campaign's success. The human cost of Mitchell's innovation was harder to quantify but equally real. How many pilots came home because their aircraft could climb above enemy fighters instead of tangling with them at medium altitudes where Japanese aircraft had the advantage? 5th Air Force's casualty analysis suggested that approximately 40 to 60 fewer P-47 pilots were killed or missing in action during the second half of 1944 compared to the first half, despite a dramatic increase in combat sortie rates. Better tactics and improved training contributed to that reduction, but so did the simple fact that pilots operating at 38,000 feet were harder to kill. Mitchell himself never received a medal for his work. The Army Air Forces didn't give decorations for wrench turning, even wrench turning that saved lives. His service record shows a technical sergeant rating, an honorable discharge in February 1946, and a notation that he'd served as a technical advisor on power plant optimization. Nothing about unauthorized modifications. Nothing about changing combat doctrine. Just another mechanic who did his job and went home. He returned to East Hartford, Connecticut, and went back to work for Pratt & Whitney. In the late 1950s, when the company was developing turbocharged engines for commercial aircraft, Mitchell found himself working on problems remarkably similar to those he'd solved in New Guinea 15 years earlier. How do you run a turbine at maximum efficiency without exceeding its structural limits? How do you train operators to use the additional performance safely? The solutions he'd developed in a maintenance tent with improvised tools became the foundation for procedures that moved into mainstream aviation engineering. A researcher from Republic Aviation tracked him down in 1962 while writing a corporate history of the P-47 program. Mitchell gave a brief interview explaining the technical details of the modifications, but he deflected credit. "I just made adjustments that needed making," he said. "The pilots were the ones who took the modified aircraft into combat. That took more courage than filing down a wastegate rod." The Republic Aviation History mentioned his contribution in 2 paragraphs. Most P-47 histories don't mention him at all, but his legacy lived on in ways he never anticipated. The procedures he developed for optimizing turbosupercharger performance in field conditions influenced post-war development of turbocharging systems for both military and commercial aircraft. The detailed monitoring protocols he created, tracking turbine speeds, manifold pressures, and exhaust gas temperatures, became standard practice in aviation maintenance. Perhaps most importantly, Mitchell proved that engineering specifications are starting points, not ending points. The 42,000-foot ceiling printed in the P-47's technical manual wasn't wrong, but it wasn't the complete story either. The complete story required understanding not just what the aircraft could do under ideal conditions, but what it needed to do under combat conditions, and how far you could safely push the boundaries between those two realities. The mythology around World War II aircraft often focuses on dramatic technological breakthroughs. The P-51 Mustang's long range, the British Spitfire's maneuverability, the Japanese Zero's climb rate. These are the stories that get told and retold because they're simple and dramatic. But the real story of air warfare is often more subtle. It's about incremental improvements made by people whose names never appeared in the history books. It's about mechanics who understood their aircraft better than the engineers who designed them. It's about the gap between what a specification sheet says an aircraft can do and what a skilled operator can actually make it do. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't need illegal modifications to be an exceptional aircraft. It was already exceptional. The turbosupercharger system that Alexander Kartveli designed in 1940 was a masterpiece of engineering that gave the P-47 altitude capabilities unmatched by any single-engine fighter in the world. What Mitchell and other mechanics did was demonstrate that the system had even more potential than its designers realized. They didn't make the impossible possible, they made the possible practical, and in combat, practical mattered more than theoretical. The technical specifications tell only part of the story. On paper, the P-47D had a maximum speed of 433 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, a service ceiling of 42,000 feet, and a rate of climb of 2,750 feet per minute. These numbers appear in every reference book about World War II aviation, but numbers don't capture what it felt like to sit in a cockpit 7 feet off the ground, surrounded by 18 cylinders of Pratt & Whitney double-wasp engine, knowing that the turbosupercharger spinning behind you at 21,000 RPM was the only thing keeping you alive at altitudes where the air was too thin to breathe. Pilots who flew both the P-47 and the P-51 Mustang often noted that the Mustang was a more refined aircraft, lighter, more responsive, with better visibility and longer range. The Mustang was an artist's tool, precise and elegant. The P-47 was a blacksmith's hammer, heavy and brutal but absolutely unstoppable when properly applied. You didn't finesse a Thunderbolt through the sky. You aimed it at a target and trusted the sheer overwhelming power of that massive engine and turbo-supercharger system to get you there faster and higher than anything the enemy could field. The psychological impact of that power was real. German pilots in Europe reported that the sound of a P-47 inches a high-speed dive was distinctive and terrifying, a whistling scream as air rushed past the huge fuselage, building in intensity as the aircraft accelerated past 500 miles per hour. Japanese pilots in the Pacific learned to scan the sky above them constantly, knowing that death could come from 38,000 feet at any moment, materializing out of the sun in the form of 7 tons of American steel moving at terminal velocity. But the most profound impact of Mitchell's work wasn't on enemy morale, it was on American tactical doctrine. Before the turbo-supercharger modifications became standard, P-47 units in the Pacific operated under significant constraints. They could escort bombers, but only at medium altitudes where Japanese fighters could intercept them. They could fly fighter sweeps, but always with the knowledge that enemy aircraft might have the altitude advantage. The modifications changed that calculus completely. By late 1944, P-47 units were routinely operating at altitudes where Japanese pilots couldn't reach them. This created a psychological shift in how American pilots approached combat. Instead of worrying about being jumped from above, they could focus entirely on selecting targets and planning attacks. The altitude advantage wasn't just a tactical benefit, it was a fundamental change in the power dynamic of air combat. Japanese commanders understood what was happening. Captured documents from late 1944 and early 1945 showed increasing concern about American fighters operating at unreachable altitudes. Some Japanese units were ordered to avoid combat above 30,000 feet entirely because the likelihood of success was too low to justify the losses. This meant that American bombers and reconnaissance aircraft operating above that altitude faced minimal fighter opposition, dramatically reducing loss rates and improving mission effectiveness. The operational statistics bear this out. In the first half of 1944, before turbo-supercharger modifications became widespread, 5th Air Force bomber missions escorted by P-47 seconds experienced an average loss rate of 2.3% to enemy fighters. In the second half of the year, after the modifications became standard, that loss rate dropped to 0.8%. Some of that improvement came from declining Japanese fighter strength as the war progressed, but operational analysis suggested that improved P-47 high-altitude performance was responsible for at least a third of the reduction. The technical lineage of Mitchell's work extended far beyond World War II. The principles he applied to optimizing turbo-supercharger performance in combat conditions influenced the development of turbocharging systems for post-war aircraft. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, which began operations in 1944, used similar exhaust-driven turbo-superchargers to maintain high-altitude performance. The lessons learned from P-47 operations, including the field modifications developed by mechanics like Mitchell, informed maintenance and operational procedures for the B-29 program. In the jet age, the fundamental principle remained relevant. Modern turbofan engines are essentially turbosuperchargers taken to their logical extreme. Instead of using exhaust gases to compress intake air for a piston engine, they use exhaust gases to compress intake air for a combustion chamber, and then use the resulting thrust directly for propulsion. The engineering challenges are similar: managing turbine speeds, preventing compressor stalls, maintaining performance across a wide altitude range. The solutions that mechanics developed for P-47 turbosuperchargers in New Guinea informed the development of jet engine operating procedures decades later. Even modern commercial aviation owes debts to that work. When you board a commercial airliner and climb to 35,000 feet, you're relying on turbofan engines whose lineage traces directly back to the turbosuperchargers that powered P-47 Thunderbolts. The computer-controlled wastegates, the pressure sensors, the safety interlocks that prevent overboosting, all of these systems evolved from concepts that mechanics like Mitchell refined in field conditions during World War II. Frank Mitchell died in 1992 at age 79. His obituary in the Hartford Courant ran 3 paragraphs mentioning his career at Pratt & Whitney, his service in World War II, and his survivors. It didn't mention P-47 seconds or turbosuperchargers or the modifications that helped establish American air superiority in the Pacific. But at aviation museums where restored P-47 Thunderbolts still fly in demonstration flights, the maintenance crews know the story. They know that the 42,000-foot ceiling printed in the technical manuals doesn't tell the whole story. They know that with proper optimization, careful maintenance, and skilled operation, the P-47's turbo-supercharger system could push the aircraft higher than any Axis fighter could reach. They know that sometimes the most important innovations don't come from engineering laboratories or corporate design teams. They come from mechanics with greasy hands and deep understanding, working in maintenance tents halfway around the world, refusing to accept that impossible means impossible. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered service as a fighter designed to excel at high altitude. It left service as a fighter that had redefined what high altitude meant. The difference between those two realities wasn't a dramatic breakthrough. It was hundreds of small improvements made by people whose names never appeared in official histories. It was mechanics who understood that specifications are guidelines, not limits. It was pilots who learned to trust those mechanics enough to take modified aircraft into combat. It was commanders who were willing to look the other way when unauthorized modifications proved themselves in battle. Alexander Kartveli deserves credit for designing the turbo-supercharger system that made the P-47 possible. But Frank Mitchell and mechanics like him deserve credit for proving that the system could do more than its designer imagined. That's the real story of innovation. Not lone geniuses having breakthrough moments, but communities of skilled practitioners pushing boundaries incrementally, learning from failures, sharing knowledge, and collectively expanding the envelope of what's possible. The mythology of the P-47 focuses on its ruggedness, its firepower, its ability to absorb battle damage. All of that is true, but the aircraft's greatest strength was simpler and more fundamental. It could climb higher than anything the enemy could field, and mechanics knew how to make it climb even higher. In air combat, altitude equals life. Everything else is details. When the last P-47 rolled off Republic Aviation's production line in November 1945, over 15,000 Thunderbolts had been manufactured. They'd flown more than 500,000 combat sorties, dropped more than 132,000 tons of bombs, and claimed over 11,000 aerial victories. They'd done all of this while maintaining a combat loss rate of only 0.7%, one of the lowest loss rates of any fighter aircraft in World War II. Those numbers represent collective achievement. Designers like Kartveli, who created the original concept, engineers at Republic Aviation and Pratt & Whitney, who refined it into a production aircraft, factory workers who built 15,000 examples to exacting standards, pilots who mastered its quirks and learned to exploit its strengths, and mechanics like Frank Mitchell who understood that the space between what the manual said and what the aircraft could actually do was where victory lived. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.